Welcome to Connections, a podcast from the Graymere Church of Christ in Columbia, Tennessee. Our goal is to have discussions and messages that encourage us and strengthen our faith. We appreciate you joining us. Let's keep learning and growing together. Hello and welcome to Connections. This is our first episode that we're filming in our newly redesigned podcast studio that's in our classroom hallway at Graymere, and really thankful for Chad Landman for setting this up. This is going to be a really nice place for us as we continue this. I hope these episodes have been encouraging to you so far. For the next several weeks, they're going to be focused on how we can build our faith. For our second quarter of our adult Bible classes, that's been the overall theme, is how we can increase our faith. And so all of our conversations are going to be focused on that. We're grateful if you're joining us. If it's a member of the Graymere Church family, there'll be a lot in here that you'll recognize and relate to, but this is open to everyone. We want these conversations to be an encouragement to anyone who's studying, seeking to grow. And I'm thankful for our guest, although he's not really a guest because he's on the ministry staff along with us here at Graymere. But John David Schwartz is with us, and we're going to be talking about faith formation in teens, and especially what we can do as parents, what we can do as a church family to help them grow. So while you probably already know John David, I don't necessarily need to introduce him the same way I would a guest, but if you could just tell us a little bit about your experience in youth ministry, what kind of drew you to youth ministry, and just kind of talk about those experiences.
Yeah. It's really interesting that I never had any plans to be in ministry growing up. And Dad started taking me on medical missions campaigns. I think my first one I was 12, so super young. But that at least, that kind of started my interest in ministry, or at least a type of ministry. Still really had no plans to do full-time ministry. I thought I'd be a doctor, a pharmacist. Dad's a doctor. Get to college, decided that biology was not for me. And then God just started opening doors for me. I got to be a traveling camp counselor for Freed Hardeman one summer. And that kind of did it for me as far as my desire to work with teenagers. Because I did that for 8 straight weeks all over the Southeast. And then I got to do 2 internships, and God just kept opening doors for me. So that was a long time ago. I've now been in youth ministry for 22 years. I'll be 23 years in April, May. And I love it. It's still what I want to do, at least for the time. So I enjoy it. It's something I'm passionate about. And obviously the desire for young people to be grounded in faith and to grow into a, not just a nominal Christian, but a Christian that's going to give back to God's kingdom and do something in the world. I think is something that you have to intentionally think about.
And one of the things, as you mentioned, intentionally thinking about development, I think probably all adults or those of us who have been long enough out of our teenage years, and we look and see the way the culture's changed, a lot of us are probably thinking about what would it be like to have to go through my teen years the way life is now, and just what kind of spiritual challenges would be there. So what have you seen are some of the spiritual challenges that our teens today are having to navigate, and maybe things that we didn't exactly have to face the same way?
Yeah, that's such an interesting and tough question at the same time. I don't know if you're like me, but there are moments where I'm like, man, I miss the days. I don't want to go back to my teen years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to go back to school or any of that, but I miss the days that I would have considered my teen years where we weren't walking around with a phone all the time. Because even though there were some of the similar challenges, the similar things, the moral challenges that I think all teenagers deal with, the sexuality, the alcohol and the substance abuse, and there are some things, the peer pressure, some things always stay the same.
Mm-hmm.
But I think now if I were a teenager today, I think this would be a totally different
Yeah.
ballgame. Because, where you seemingly had to, at least when I was a teenager, when we were teenagers, we, if you wanted to get involved in that kind of stuff, you had to look for it.
Hmm.
There was a much more difficult avenue that you often had to go through to get some of that stuff,
Yeah.
that were the challenges and the temptations. But now, man, these kids are walking around with this stuff in their pockets every day, 24/7.
Yeah.
To me, I think the cell phone is the biggest, and not cell phone in and of itself, but the things that you can get there,
Yeah.
that just, um, social media. You can work as hard as you can. I remember Jason Helton coming and talking to us several months ago about some of this social media stuff and its effects on teenagers. And one of the things that he mentioned was, the algorithms and the fact that you can work so hard to keep certain things out of your thread, and yet it will still just randomly pop up every once in a
Yes.
while
Yeah.
and all of a sudden grab you again. And, um, Satan's always worked. Satan is very crafty and very cunning in what he does. But there's just something about the cell phone that just seems way more difficult to me than maybe what we dealt with. I don't know. What are your thoughts
Yeah.
on that?
Well, you mentioned that there was a time you had to really look for stuff. And as you said that, I thought, yeah, and now it's looking for us, and it's looking
That's a great way
for,
to say it.
all of our kids. And it does seem like there's a time where parents could, by knowing where your children were and where your teenagers were, you could have a sense of controlling what they were exposed to. But now physical location can be anywhere, and they can be exposed to anything. And it's a whole different way of thinking about it. And in reality, preparing our teens for just the fact that even if you're doing things with the best of intentions, there's going to be something that shows up in an inbox or
Yeah.
on your screen that you're going to have the discipline and have already made the decision to say, I'm not going to engage in this,
Yeah.
and that's tough. That can be
Yeah.
really hard especially when it kind of takes you by surprise like that. And I wonder too about you mentioned social media part of it. And I mean, it's easy in one way, it's easy for us to be critical of the social media in general. But it's just kind of a heightened way of people communicating and doing things they're already doing other places, but now it's more insidious. It can affect more people.
Right.
And so what are some of the social media things that you've seen teens struggle with, wrestle with, and how has that changed even in the last 3 or 4 years?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, let me throw this caveat in there first that social media, I think, is probably the biggest challenge. I don't, like you said, it's not, I don't want anybody to think that I'm just negative on a cell phone or
Right.
there's not a place for social media. What I would say in regards to any of the struggles that our teenagers have is that as adults or parents, even sometimes where we might fail is thinking that we don't need to be almost nosy in our
Mhm.
children's lives, well, that's my child's phone. I don't have a right to get into that. Well,
Yeah.
sure you do. Well, those are my children's friends. I don't have a right to tell them, the type of people that they ought to be dealing with. Well, sure we do. When our children were little, we made sure that they ate certain types of foods.
Mhm.
And if we were willing to be that intentional and that involved at 2, 3, and 4 years old, how much more involved do we need to be at 13, 14, 15 years old? And so I go back to Deuteronomy 6. Often to me, it's the simple moments in scripture that to me lay out the best plans that God has for us, where Moses says, hey, parents, you make sure that you are constantly teaching your children to love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, right?
Mhm.
I mean, that is, I remember the the Israelites called the Shema, right? That is something that was on the front of their minds, or supposed to be on the front of their minds every single day. And you can't do that with you can't teach that with children without being intentional and even nosy at times, making sure that their heart is in the right place or their mind is in the right place, make sure that they're focused on the right things. So I'll just to back up before I jump into the next question that you asked, parents, be nosy. That's one thing that I would say, and I wish more parents would do for the spiritual sake of their teenagers. But I think maybe sometimes we're not afraid. We just don't want to overstep. But as parents, that's our right. We have the right to overstep and to make sure that our children are where they need to be and doing what they need to be doing.
Yeah, it's kind of like our memories of growing up with, phones that were, connected to the wall and landlines and all that stuff. But when you were talking on a phone, at least when I was at my house, if I was talking to someone and mom and dad were nearby, they're going to be listening into what we're talking about.
Yeah.
When it got to a certain point where it was too late for me to be on the phone, I mean, it was pretty normal to someone to pick up and say, "Hey, all right, so it's time to get off," and put it back.
Yeah.
Like that was part of life. And so as I think about it, when we're being nosy like that, we're just doing the 21st century version of that, of just, hey, screen time is the 21st century version of time to get off the phone, like all those kinds of things. But it is hard. And I do think that parents often have a genuinely coming from a great place motivation of, I don't want to be overbearing.
Sure.
But we also have to give ourselves reminders that we have, if we're paying for the phone, if we're we have some responsibilities too. And that's a tough thing for parents, I think.
Well, and I know that it stems from a little bit. It's funny that it was a goofy conversation that me and Abigail were having this morning. And it was one of those where she got a little frustrated with me because I was laying out, here's our plan. And, it was just a weird reminder. She's 18, fixing to go off to college.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, I could do this and make her happy, or I could teach this life lesson and her be a little frustrated at me. And again, it was a goofy thing. So it's not like it's a big deal, but I think sometimes we are reluctant as parents because we don't want our children to dislike us.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, if my goal is only for my children to like me, then I'm going to be doing a lot of things for or on the behalf of my children that are actually more detrimental and more harmful to them because I'm not keeping them away from the things that are bad for them. Yeah. If I want them to like me, they're going to have ice cream for every meal. If I want them to like me, they're going to, be allowed to stay up on their phones till 3:00 in the morning. If I want them to like me, then they don't have to do homework. But I think every one of us would know logically that that doesn't make sense, in everyday life. So, my thought on that would just be, our God's calling and obligation for us as parents to be the spiritual formation kind of leaders in our children's lives is that we direct them to heaven before anything else matters, and that means they might not like my decisions from time to time, but that's okay. They know I love them,
that's such a good point of just of focusing. And I think all of us as parents, I know I do, I need to have moments where we refocus on, hey, what's my overall goal here?
Mm-hmm.
And that helps. When you think about, navigating some of these challenges, one of the primary challenges that we hear a lot about, or a topic of discussion, has to do with identity and forming your identity. And because they have this increased access, they also now have increased access to people and communities of people everywhere that have an idea or an agenda of, here's what your identity should look like, and we can help you. And so as parents, or as members of this church family that are trying to help teenagers find out who they are, and specifically who they are in Christ, what are some things you've observed? What suggestions would you have to help us help them?
Yeah, and I didn't mean to get away from the other question, but that's exactly what I was going to say. Was the challenge with social media, I think, is identity, and our kids figuring out who they are. let me just talk about some of those challenges for a minute. I think the biggest struggle with kids, is, and even before social media, you had, alcoholic ads. You remember so everything is always portrayed to be better or to look better than it is.
Yeah.
The problem for children is, at a, you know, when a cell phone is in their hand, and they can look at all of that stuff without having a parent remind them of those dangers on a regular basis, then all of those portrayals begin to sink in as far as this is what I'm supposed to look like, or this is what I'm supposed to do. And I remind teenagers on a regular basis, in our classes on Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights is, hey, just as a reminder, most people don't post the bad moments. They don't post when they're getting out of the bed in the morning and their hair is all over the place. They're posting, when they've spent an hour and a half on their makeup or their hair, and they've now got the clothing that somebody's sponsoring them to wear. People don't post when they throw, 2 interceptions in a ball game. They post, the 3 passes that really look good, even if the team lost. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that's one of the biggest struggles for teenagers is just figuring out, who am I and where do I fit in a culture where everything is supposed to be so perfectly presented? Which then you asked, in the last 3 or 4 years, what are we seeing? And I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a counselor by any stretch of the imagination. But I'll tell you one of the things that I've seen more and more and more. When I started youth ministry in 2002, there was not one kid in my youth group that struggled with anxiety that I knew of. If they struggled with anxiety or depression, I didn't know about it, and chances were that the parents were dealing with it in-house, and taking care of it, or maybe they didn't even know.
Right.
But in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been such an uptick of, even the last 10 years, an uptick of depression and anxiety in teenagers. And I think it's because of all these societal pressures of how they're supposed to look, how they're supposed to perform, how they're supposed to present themselves. And if they don't live up to that standard, that is constantly on their feed every time they open their phone up, then it's throwing them into a really just a really difficult mental place, an emotional place.
Yeah.
That to me is one of the scary things about where we are as a culture right now, and the identity aspect. It's already tough enough for teenagers to try to figure out who they are. Now give them thousands of images a day of what culture tells them they're supposed to be, and they don't know how to navigate that at a young age. And to me, it just perpetuates the entire situation.
Yeah. And when you say that, I'm trying to think too of just our own history or our age group. But I do remember hearing a lot when I was in high school and even in college of people talking about, magazines that you would see like in the checkout line at the grocery store, and about how the standards of beauty, especially for girls, you've got this impossibly high standard because someone on a, magazine cover has been retouched and airbrushed and all that. And so it's almost like with social media, when you've got the ability to do that yourself with filters or whatever else. Now instead of only seeing that when you're at a grocery store, you're seeing it all the time. And if it was dangerous enough for people to talk about when we were teenagers, and all you were doing was seeing it in, either in movies or in, grocery store, seeing people who were setting an impossible standard of how to look or how to act or how to, just what would it be like to have that 24 hours a day always available, is really powerful. And there's it's an illustration that I think of a lot that one of my favorite authors, Neil Postman, wrote about just technology in general. But he said that one of the biggest disruptors in American history was when the telegraph was invented, because when you had the telegraph, people in all these different towns, instead of just worrying about what was happening in their towns, you were getting like real time updates, like not just letters and stuff of something that happened that you couldn't do anything about. You're getting real time updates that in another town, something else was happening, but there's nothing you could do about it.
Yeah.
You were just getting all this information. And so you can kind of look through the different, between radio, TV, internet, the effect that has on our psyche when there's more information coming in and there's nothing we can do to address it. There's nothing I can do to help it, and it seems like social media's version of that is now I'm not just judging my life by the people I'm living around. It's by everybody who's living everywhere, and just, it's no wonder that we have the increase in, the anxieties that exist, because now kids are learning to worry about things they might never have even thought about until getting that in there. So,
and one thing too, I don't want to make it sound like I came in here only to talk about social media.
Sure. Yeah.
When you talk about identity, I think there are a lot of other struggles as well, that we as parents, if we're not careful, we're allowing, our children to find their identity in things that aren't truly fulfilling or aren't long lasting, So let's step outside of social media then, and you start talking about, theater and sports and education, all of those things that are a big deal part of our society. And man, I'm for all of those things. I enjoyed all of those things growing up, not necessarily the education part. I hated high school. I didn't like school in general. I like learning, but I didn't like the work part of it, So anyways, but I guess the point I'm making is that if we allow our teenagers to try to find their identity in any area, first of all, that is outside of who God created us to be, then our teenagers are in danger, And one of the ways that we as parents perpetuate that sometimes is, our kid, either we push them or we allow our kids to find their interest, but then we make everything in their life revolve around that interest.
Yeah.
I mean, anything you pick what it is. And if that's your approach to that thing, basketball or theater or, my kid wants to be the valedictorian. Well, everything they do is geared around that. Then what happens is, they build up a false sense of identity in who they are and completely forget about who God made them to be. Because the danger with all of those things is, and even with social media, at some point, you may not have that. It gets taken away from you, or it just completely fails you altogether.
Yeah.
Who are you after that? And so that's where, thinking about all of the things that our children are involved in, whatever it is, I would like to challenge parents to say, hey, are you making sure your kid knows who they are outside of this? And it might mean that they don't do that for a season,
Yeah.
When I was growing up, you had different seasons for every sport. Now, every sport is year round.
Yeah.
Well, what if we went back to that model, or what if parents chose to go back to that model for their children to say, hey, when it's basketball season, you're playing basketball. If you want to practice, or whatever in the driveway or whatever outside of basketball season, that's fine. But we're not going to go to, 50 other weekend tournaments in basketball. What could that do for that child's identity if instead of replacing who God has called them to be, and them learning where they are in God's kingdom, and spending their time with God on the Lord's day, that helps bolster who they are and their heart transformation, as opposed to just always doing this other stuff.
Yeah.
Colossians 3 is huge for me when I'm talking to parents and talking about that one little phrase when Paul says, I think it's verse 4, when Christ, who is our life, he's talking about the preeminence of Christ. If he is our life, then that means he's always first. And there's going to be times where we set other things aside.
Yeah.
That's not a bad thing when it comes to helping our children learn who they are. Because I think every parent would say, well, let me just put it this way. I've never had a parent in my youth group or in a church where I work say, yeah, I don't want my child to look like Jesus.
Right.
Okay. Nobody ever says that. But then you look at the behavior or the life or the priorities, and we want our children to look like Jesus, but we're spending all of our time and our effort and our resources for them to look like an NBA star.
Right.
And what happens when you blow out your knee? What happens when, you can no longer sing or act the way you want to? What happens when all of a sudden a life for Christ doesn't line up with the behaviors and the morals of this group of people? You're going to have to choose.
Yeah.
And, where is your identity actually coming from?
Yeah. That's so powerful. And especially when you think about just all those questions we ask ourselves in those teen years about, who am I and what am I good at, and how easy it is to become fixated and focused on one specific area rather than thinking about God forming our identities. I did want to bring up or give you a chance to talk about, different studies over the years have pointed to the importance of teens having relationships and knowing older Christians, like knowing them and being familiar with them, so that as they go through a youth program or something, when they graduate, when they get to that point of adulthood, they feel comfortable with, adult Christians and with other members of the church. So if you could just share some of the ways that the Graymere Student Ministry is trying to make sure those relationships are there.
Sure. First of all, I would hope that any church is trying to model that intergenerational type relationship that's found in Titus 2, where the older teaches the younger and shows them what a faith look like and the life of faithfulness to God looks like. I do think that is key in, going back to that identity aspect is, you need people to surround you to build you up as who you are and who God wants you to be. Right. And so, the book Sticky Faith talks about surrounding a teenager. A teenager in his most formative years needs to be connected to 5 other Christian adults, not just their parents, but that will help them learn what faith is, give them encouragement and confidence in who they are as a Christian, as a child of God. So one of the things that we try to do in our student ministry is we call it 1, 2, 10 mentoring. And it's really the 1 and the 2 and the 10 is based on Romans 12 verses 1, 2, and then 10. Learning how to be a living sacrifice, not conformed to the world, but transformed. And then verse 10, learning how to love each other and have those relationships. But then it's also kind of a play on those numbers that, 1 or 2 adults are going to impact multiple teenagers in that group. And so every Sunday night, when our adults are in the auditorium, our youngest children are in their Graymere Kids classes, we're in our youth activity center, and our teenagers are sitting with the very same adults every single week. And so far it's worked that the majority of our mentors have chosen to continue to be a part of the process over the course of the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, huge because these adults every Sunday night are having an opportunity not only to worship with those teenagers, but to sit and pray with those teenagers about very specific things. And then, when we have discussion questions in my teaching, I let them break off and talk about, that scripture or that situation in life. And they're learning to trust those adults. But then also I've gotten to watch it with some of those teenagers who have graduated and moved out. Now they've got connections to adults that are in the church already, and not just with other teenagers. So that's been a pretty huge thing that we've done. And I think our adults really enjoy it. Our teenagers, they're not going to admit that they enjoy things all the time, but
that's true.
But when they walk into the Yak and they go have, just organic conversations with adults, and you're not having to force that.
Yeah.
It's pretty neat to see those connections being made, and it just turns the church into a place for everybody,
Yeah.
So that's been pretty big for us.
Wow. That's great. And it makes so much sense that would be helpful to teens, but to have a way that kind of, is intentional about it and sort of prompts us to be intentional about it as a congregation, that's huge too. One other thing as we think about this discussion as a whole, what are some things that you, from your vantage point in youth ministry, wish that more people knew about what our teens were going through, or about what some of the challenges of ministry to teens that age can be? Like, what are some things that we probably don't think of, or maybe that's so far in our rear view we don't think about that time of life anymore?
I think now, I'm gonna go back to the old what I heard a comedian the other day talk about, back in the 1900s.
Right,
well, yeah. So these days, I look backwards, back in the 1900s, things were much more black and white. There, you knew what was right and you knew it was wrong. And your parents, at least my parents were pretty instrumental in helping me understand, here's the black and white, here's what's right, here's what's wrong. We live in a culture now where everything is questioned when it didn't used to be.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Try not to get in too much specifics, but let me just throw out the age old. Even when I was in high school, we didn't find out till later, but one of my peers got pregnant, and it was enough of one of those situations where they did everything they could to keep it hidden because of the shame. Now, I wouldn't want any person to feel such shame as though they're unwanted or devalued, right?
Yeah.
But we lived in a time and place where right was right and wrong was wrong. Fast forward 25 years, and nothing's right or wrong anymore in this world, and especially for teenagers. Especially, we've talked so much about identity, but now that they can see any identity take any shape or any form, and especially on social media, and they're that to me is a challenge that I think adults need to be aware of, is that kids, I guess, try to summarize in this way. If a kid comes up to ask questions, I don't think they're trying to challenge the Bible, when it comes to sexuality or, alcoholism or anything like that. I don't think teenagers are genuinely trying to challenge the Bible when they're asking questions that me and you have known the answers for years, right? But I think sometimes if we're not careful, we kind of act like, well, you should know this. Well, that's not fair, because now we live in a world where information is so just pressed on them every single day. If they want to know what's in the Bible, it's probably coming from a genuine place. Be patient. Take the time to sit down and say, hey, let me help you with this. Let me just show you what God's word says. I think that would be huge. That would be one of those.
Yeah.
And so that's why I've appreciated a lot our mentors who do take the time to spend that time with teenagers. Say, here's what I struggled with. Here's how God's word helped me. That'd probably be a big one.
Yeah.
I haven't been able to think of any others outside of what we've already really talked about. I guess one other thing I would want to say to the church, to the older church generations at church, is that teenagers want to be involved in the church. They want to work in the church. man, we just got back from Peru, and those teenagers
Mhm.
wanted to go out
Yeah.
and do something every day. And then at night when we had our, what we called the bazaar, in that open air gymnasium. And while me and you were sitting over there having Bible studies with other adults, there were adults at these other stations, but those teenagers were the ones running the slime,
Right.
the slime zone, and the, braiding the hair of the little girls and playing chess with boys and making relationships.
Yeah.
Man, the teenagers really, in a big way, were the engine for what took place for us at Peru.
Absolutely.
And I just say, we need to make sure that we're propping up our teenagers and their opportunities to work and be instrumental and integral parts of the Lord's church.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great way for us to bring our thoughts together to a conclusion. But hopefully this has been a conversation that's encouraged all of us to think of specific ways that we can be a source of strength and inspiration to our teens, and just to connect with them. That's another thing that you talk about, connecting and forming relationships. That short-term mission trip, like the one we took to Peru, does make you feel closer to everyone you're on that trip with. And so just finding ways to get involved. An adult doesn't have to do everything that the student
Sure.
ministry does, but there are ways, if you're interested in encouraging our teenagers.
Well, and can I just
there are ways to do that.
insert one simple thing that any
Absolutely.
adult could do? If you see a teenager, whether you know them or not, introduce yourself to them and say, I want to pray for you this week. What is something I could be praying?
Yeah.
They might look at you like, what is happening here? But I've also learned that teenagers, it is a comfort to them to know that people are praying for them
Yeah.
and the things that they're facing at school. So that would be
That'd be great.
my last thought
Yeah.
on this topic. Just pray for a teenager.
That's an awesome idea, and something that anybody can do that. All you have to do is be at worship in C1 or C1 even around town. I mean, just making that connection. So I hope that this has been encouraging to you. These are released every week. And so if you're listening to this, we do have the video version on our YouTube channel. And if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, it is available on podcast platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Again, thanks to the work of Chad Landman for making that available. But we want to just highlight conversations that'll be spiritually encouraging and help us reflect on our faith. And so we hope this has done that, and we appreciate you joining us and spending time with us on Connections. Thank you for being part of Connections. We hope it was an encouragement to you. If you live in the Columbia area and don't have a church home, we would love for you to worship with us. You can find out information about meeting times, classes, and what to expect at graymere.com. You will always receive a warm welcome from the Graymere Church of Christ.